But that brings us back to this scavenging mechanic where we're looking for that last little something. And I think that we've exhausted the inspiration from survival horror. I mean, even saying that is kind of self-defeating in a way. So you probably should never say that you've exhausted the inspiration from something. It gets your mind to the point where it's thinking, okay, all right, we got to go on to the next thing. Maybe there is still something that we could find in survival horror that could fill out this last sort of space, this last blank that we haven't figured out yet. Um, the thing about this ability in particular, the reason why it's a good level or a good rank too, is that not having any control over what you get is is actually a really good way of balancing. Well, I guess having a set probability of getting something that you don't ever quite want or isn't ever quite good enough is a good concept. And I think the best implementation of that I've seen recently is in Hearthstone. The shaman, his hero ability is to summon totems, and those totems on their own aren't particularly good. They're not. They're about as strong as a one mana cost creature, um, and it's completely randomized. I think the best totem is probably the 0/2 taunt totem. Um, but the totems themselves are always helpful in a way. They're always adding something to your board presence. You just never get to pick what that something is, and I think that's a really cool way of kind of managing that. It is a little bit RNG. I kind of try and avoid RNG for balance purposes. Uh, but there's such a thing as balanced RNG, and I think that that's what this skill is kind of going to be going for. We need a guy who is completely self-sufficient, but still relies on his environment. I was worried about. I was thinking about why scavenging isn't a great mechanic for him, but I think it actually does make a lot of sense. If you look at survival horror protagonists, they're also very self-sufficient, but they're up against such ridiculous odds that they need to use the environment to survive. Um, and you always kind of have to think about your enemies as it's easy in an RPG to forget how many enemies you're killing as a character. Um, because just battle by battle, it never feels like the odds are overwhelming. But if you really go through and do the math, in your average RPG, each character is killing like, or your average grindy RPG, each character is killing like thousands of enemies, or just high hundreds of enemies. Um, and your average person can't do that, which is why you have these classes, of course, these adventurers who are beyond your stereotypical NPCs power level, or just have better training, etc. So you kind of have to think of it in those terms, like what are my characters? What do my characters have that set them apart? Um, and you need to introduce that early enough so that it feels like these are if your character is that way, like the Lawstrider, for example, was a professional mercenary, so he should feel um, like he's not just a mewling kitten when he first starts out, and he needs to be bringing things from that background into his kit before he fully develops his identity. Um, so that's another story that you're telling is what is he bringing from his past life into his current life, and I think that scavenging is something that definitely would apply there, and it's something that if we go in, we have that sort of orc raid on your village. Um, it would make sense that the upgrade to your scavenging stuff would come about the time that that's happening around rank 8, when you need to implement those skills to help the villagers survive. So there's just the question of what's the last thing. If we look at Hearthstone, they have a 1/1 creature guy who can attack. They have a taunting guy that can protect you. They have a healing guy that helps your units to survive, and they have a spell damage amplifier. I think we've got the spell damage amplifier here. We've got the healing guy here. We don't want to have a taunting guy, and we don't necessarily want to have something that attacks. These are things that we're pulling from our environment. And actually, those bombs would be an example of the 1/1 attacking guy. We would be pulling things from our environment that allow us to survive, not necessarily to attack better. And if a studio like Blizzard, with as many resources as they had, could only come up with those four, or those were the best four that they were selecting, then in my mind I start to think, well, maybe there isn't a really good third one for us to find if we're cutting off, if we're creating a box for ourselves and staying within that box. But we have our parameters, and we need to think. I need to believe, and we need to believe as a team, that it's possible to find that solution. Because if you don't believe it, then you're not going to find it, or you'll find it much later. So when you're going through an environment, what are you trying to find that'll help you survive? Looking back at the survival horror games that I've played, like Dead Rising, you're trying to find weapons. You're trying to find health. You're trying to find things that increase the character's EXP, or help them unlock new moves, new abilities. You're trying to find ammo for your weapons. Well, okay. If we think of this in another way, we could have sustain. We could have it be mana sustain, like you could get mana back as well, not just health. But that's sort of splitting up the sustain in a strange way. Like maybe your sustain is HP and mana. So you have a chance of getting some health back, a low amount of health back and a low amount of mana back that kind of refunds what it cost you to use the thing. So instead of having that would be an example of an ability that I think that the designer hadn't thought through all the way. If you have this restores HP, this powers up your next attack, and this restores mana, that just feels like a real cop-out for the player, because you could have put the HP and the mana together and found a way to balance that. You just didn't want to think through and find the real solution to your problem. And the real solution is something else entirely different. More likely than not, it's something else entirely different than what you were initially expecting. Oftentimes, sorry for the yawn, guys. Oftentimes when you're going through, you'll find that the first two things are pretty easy, but and I might use this analogy frequently as we go through, but it feels a lot like a Jenga tower that you're building up and pulling pieces out of, and it's stacked very high. Even as early as here at the rank 2, you're trying to make sure that the base fits the top, and everything cohesively fits the narrative side of things. But you also have to make sure that this small little whatever this is going to be fits these two things on a very small level. That's important, because even if you have 28 classes like we intend to have, and you have 10 skills per class, most players who play your game are going to get really attached to the first thing that they play. And if the first thing that they play has this ability that hasn't been thought through, then they're not really going to want to access the rest of what you built, or they're gonna feel like you just weren't trying as hard. And that's fair criticism. It really is. You got to put your all into every single ability. That doesn't mean they all have to be as interesting as one another. Like the Cavalier's first ability is just that he gains a mobility charge after he attacks. That in and of itself isn't all that interesting. And at level 1, it's not all that good either. It kind of helps you dodge stuff, and you can use it to your advantage, sure. But what makes that ability interesting is how it builds into the rest of the kit after rank 1. And so the ability in and of itself, when you first get it, could be, I'll admit, maybe a little bit underwhelming to a player. But as they see the thought that we put into incorporating it into the rest of the build, I think they'll be more happy with the toolkit that they discover. All of which is to say that this thing in and of itself doesn't have to be the best ability that's ever made, but it does have to fit in with these two things, and it can't feel lazy. So how do we avoid that laziness going forward? What are we really thinking that we need? Well, we've got the sustain part of it. We've got the power up and reloading, getting more resources part of it. I guess these are both concerned with resources, as they should be, because this is about scavenging. So what other resources? Just really got to think hard. What other resources are we really looking for, hunting for in the heat of battle in a small town? If you're moving from house to house, or if you're just on the battlefield and some enemies have died and you gotta move from one body to the next one. Are you replacing your weapon? Well, it depends. Is your weapon broken? Probably not. But if I think about that more, maybe you're starting to get broken down, and it's not just about your HP or your mana. It's that you've been afflicted with something like poison. Are you trying to sort of buttress yourself against those effects? Are you picking up cloth and protecting your mouth? Would you have a resistance to enemy stacks and charges that get put on you? I think that's taking like a little bit too far into cleanse territory. But I didn't want to rule out the possibility before I thought it through. So we don't want it to be a cleanse. We don't want it to be another power-up. Now I'm thinking that maybe we just have it to be a 50-50 between this one or the next one, but that's a cop-out too. It has to be something that he's picking up that restores something to him. So what is he losing as he goes through combat? He's losing mana. He's losing HP. The player is losing attention the longer that the battle goes on, probably. So this serves to increase, to re-engage them. It's sort of like, oh, cool, I really want to be at my next attack. Almost like a cliffhanger does. Like, this more or less says, make it to your next turn, and you're going to do something really cool next turn. So they're losing attention, they're losing HP, they're losing mana, they're losing time. But that's never something that you want to point out when you're developing a game, unless you're doing it in either a tongue-in-cheek way or a meta-referential way. And maybe we'll do something like that with the Ritsmith. Maybe he could be a sort of comment on games in general. How they tend to sap your youth away from you. You spend time playing them. But that's not really necessary. There's no real reason to add that. We're not. Well, maybe there is, but we won't know till later. Alright, so you're losing time. You're losing allies if they're dying. But that I don't want this to really factor into the allies because that'll happen later. Um, you're losing interest in using the same things over and over again, which this addresses pretty well, I think. And then early in your toolkit, I think you're maybe losing interest in continuing if the stuff you're getting isn't interesting enough on its own. Like you might put points into another tree that seems more interesting to you. So that's why we have to make rank 1 really fun to use if we're going to be saddling. And it's not like we're saddling them with something uninteresting here, but if we're putting RNG into the kit, then this has to be um, the thing that they're using every turn to really whittle down the enemy. Have a bit of burst in it. God, this last one is hard. Scavenging. What are you grabbing? What are you taking? How is it helping you? Let's go to the good old thesaurus, because I've run out of imagery. Lurking, roaming. It's not. Okay. This is an example. I was talking about this the other day, but I couldn't find a great example. Scavenging is about finding items and being resourceful. But here, they're only acknowledging the prowling side of it, the thing that has the most synonyms. So, so now we have to sort of go to resourceful instead. But here it says imaginative. It's not talking anything about the resources themselves. So then we have to go to resource. And that's where this site is sort of incomplete. It's not like it could ever be as complete as you'd want it to be either. No one when they're making a site like this is thinking that it's going to be implemented in the way that I'm implementing it, I guess, or that we're choosing to implement it. And maybe a regular thesaurus is more equipped to handle these queries, but this is the most accessible option I've found. I hate flipping through a thesaurus to find things. I'd much rather just type in the words. It's kind of stifling. It takes a long time. So if we look at resources, there's a horde, ingenuity, makeshift. That factors into that bomb thing we were talking about. Contraptions, creation, wealth. I think that's something that another designer might do, or another game might do, is have it provide you, like, slowly start accumulating extra EXP throughout the battle or something like that. But that's worthless in PvP, and it's also much less. It's kind of, if you take it in a sort of diegetic versus non-diegetic, and what diegetic means, for those who aren't familiar, is within the world of the game. So one is diegetic. You're taking things from your environment and you're gaining something for it immediately and applying that to the battle. Whereas experience, even if you think about it in a diegetic way, like the person's actually gaining experience, it's so ingrained into us from playing RPGs that experience is a system that it's really hard to separate, or it's really hard to meld the two, rather. It's hard to say, like, experience is this diegetic system. And certainly for battle in general, experience does not factor in on a turn-by-turn basis into the diegesis of combat. It happens after and before combat and influences the next interaction, but never plays an active part. It's always a passive factor that occurs before or after. So you would never want to be providing someone extra experience for using this ability, or extra gold at the end of the battle, or something like that. Those systems aren't cohesive with the ones that we've already put in place. Support, reserve, property, capital, resource, beginning device, enterprise, facility, initiative. if we look at surplus and then we find an antonym, lacking, wanting, necessary, needing, desire, require, deprivation, short, desiring, absorbing, crying, exigent, claim, concentrate. Yeah, I don't know if the words are helping. I think we were getting further with references to survival horror, where scavenging is the most important. So we'll go back to that. Survival horror, scavenging. First-person shooters, you kind of have to scavenge too, but it's only for ammo and health. So what is it in RPGs that's different from those games? What's another axis that we could take this along? Because what we're doing is we're making their systems fit within our context, but maybe we have an additional sort of, like the example from Final Fantasy earlier, where you're taking your inventory and you're taking something that's non-diegetic and you're making it diegetic. You're bringing it into the world of the game and making your inventory a weapon. And I think that's kind of what's off-putting about it for a player, is you don't ever consider your inventory to be a weapon against the enemies, at least not in an active way. Just like you wouldn't think that you could throw your experience bar at someone, like trade experience for damage. That's a little off-putting, even if it's explained really well. We kind of, it's almost like an uncanny valley kind of reaction. It feels really icky. So we're trying to avoid that sort of functional ickiness. We don't want to design it around an axis that players don't feel is a part of the world. We want to determine which parts of our world are different from survival horror games. And so far, I think we've identified a few, but it's much harder to see what's not there than it is to see what's there. Like, when I'm accounting for a situation, I'm looking through my room, for instance. Maybe this doesn't need an example, but I'm going to use it anyway. And someone asks me what's there, or what's the thing that I think is most present in the room. I would start talking about how the walls are cream colored, and I think that the color cream is the most present in the room, or that the architecture is the most present thing in the room. Because these are all things that I can see, but really probably the thing that's filling up the most volume in the room is air. And that's what's not there. That's what's not immediately apparent. And that's what I need to discover here. That's what we need to be looking for, is the air in the situation that we can't see. And it's much, much harder to do that with systems that aren't visual. Because you have to create the room for yourself and then start looking through it and finding what's not immediately apparent, like what's between the walls, and building your walls out of things like sustain, sustenance of HP and mana, and ammo that powers up your next attack, leads to something that's much more abstract, a much more figurative construct. And once again, I think that there could certainly be some criticisms levied against the inefficiency of our method here, our design methodology. Maybe we should just move on to another ability and sort of design from there, but I get very, very hung up on challenges or puzzles that need to be solved. And I don't like going on to the next one until I've solved the current one. It's not like you're taking a multiple choice test and there's a correct answer there and you gotta find it. This is much more like an essay, or just a short answer question where you have to figure out the question before you're solving the answer. So right now we're trying to figure out the question that we need to ask ourselves to discover what the answer is. And the question currently is, what is the air? Or as David Foster Wallace would say, or in his really great commencement speech at Kenyon, he talks about it's called "This Is Water," and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to go watch it on YouTube. You should do so immediately. But he's talking about the same thing. He's talking about how we don't recognize we're the fish in the fishbowl, or the fish in the ocean, who don't recognize that they're swimming through water. We don't have a self-awareness of our perspective, of our own lens. So what we're trying to do here is just bring in as many different lenses, comparative lenses as we can, and once we get enough of them assembled, once we look at it from a survival horror perspective, from an RPG perspective, from a game design perspective, from a humanistic perspective, once we can acknowledge all of the biases of those and have them become cohesive, or have the lenses looking at the same thing, oftentimes you'll find your answer for something that's really stumping you. Unfortunately, because of the explanation of that process, I haven't really been thinking about how all of the lenses kind of come together to reveal this big answer for this rank 2 ability in one of our 28 classes. Oh, it doesn't matter, but it matters a lot. Just it's so consternating to sit here and realize within the grand scheme of things how unimportant this is, or how unimpactful it is, and have to treat it like it's the most important thing in the world. You're really deluding yourself. You're psyching yourself up and depriving yourself of that self-awareness. Or I guess since I said self, you could just say awareness, but you're depriving yourself of awareness so that you can fully commit to the systems, fully commit to the fact that this is necessary and a very important thing. You're tricking yourself into it by making it important, by reading into it. And I suppose that maybe is an aspect of self-awareness that I'd rather not have while trying to make something like this work. But really, a lot of the time when you're playing games, you're using the game as an escape. You're using the narrative, the systems as an escape from something else in your life. And games just happen to be a very efficient form of escape, and a very entertaining form of escape because they're designed to be. People sit and they think about the player. They really cater everything to the player. Like what I'm doing for instance, so that it's fun and all of it works well. So you're able to be distracted. You're in a room that's very comfortable to be in. You don't have to think about what's outside of it. And when you're designing, you almost have to think of the design process as a game in and of itself. Each ability is a puzzle. And of course we're getting very meta here, and probably being, scare quotes, deeper than we need to be, but these are more of my what do you call them? It's when you don't feel very, very confident in something. It's a fairly easy word to remember. I could go look up the thesaurus entry. I probably should do so, just so I can figure out the word, because this has become my new puzzle, I guess. But It starts with in, uh, I believe. Unconfident. Um, Insecurities. There we go. They're more of my insecurities, I think, that are coming through than maybe actual truths or truisms about design. But I think anything that you fully commit yourself to becomes a pretty accurate reflection of self. Any small moment when you're choosing one thing or another, you're committing a portion of yourself to it. Like I don't know on the micro level if picking a Coke over a Pepsi really makes you feel any better about yourself. But certainly carrying home or putting a name brand box of Coca-Cola on a checkout counter um, when you're rich, and then having a poor person come up behind you who has three kids, and she's got the store brand cola and like a 4 pack of it, or just a 2 liter bottle because that's what her kids wanted, and they were begging her for it, and she puts that up behind your box, and you've got like two or three of them, and then a whole bunch of groceries. Maybe it takes the situation uh, for it to say something about the person, or for the poor person behind the rich person to really feel the inequity. But uh, the choice, how you commit yourself to even the smallest of things and how it makes you feel about yourself is all very valid, and it's a largely valid part of game design. It's not something that if I get the chance to think about it, I usually ignore. So I apologize for the digression, but I think that's what's such a huge part. If I can segue back into why the characters matter, that's why it's so hugely important to make all of these systems about the psychology of the character, so that when the player chooses them, they feel like they are the character, or they're an agent um, within that identity. That's what's so nice about reading books is the book tells you everything about the character, and you really have no control over what happens. You're just in that person's head for a little while, escaping. And what's great about video games, probably the best thing that the medium can do, is take a book like that and change it from being this linear experience into a cooperative experience between the character and the player. Not that reading is not a cooperative experience, but it's much less interactive um, in a way. What you're trying to produce as a game designer is something that is limitlessly interactive. Of course, you have to put constraints, but as much control as you can give to the player without breaking the the fourth wall, or breaking the systems of the game, you try and afford it to them because you want them to be invested and committed in what you've created. So, so the best thing about having rounded characters, where their abilities really figure in to their psychology, is that you end up with a player who isn't necessarily playing an RPG as they would play any other RPG, where they're comfortable being a mage or most comfortable being a warrior. It's a player who expects to be playing the archetypical warrior and ends up um, playing through as a character instead, inhabiting the perspective of that person, making that person real. Um, so we're trying to make that person real right now, even if it's something as small as just what they're scavenging for. What's important for them to scavenge for? What are they looking for? What's the and this is a good way of looking at it too. This is creating another lens, which is why it's helpful to talk through. But if I'm the Lawstrider and I'm ripping through a house very quickly to try and save someone, and I've been hurt, um, I'm I'm going to be trying to look for something that allows me to keep going. I'm going to be grabbing bandages or something like that and tearing at them with my teeth and wrapping around myself. So I'm really not going to be getting very much from it, but it'll help me to keep going. Um, and in much the same way, ammo helps you keep going, or a repair for your sword or another weapon or something like that. That gets you to the next person. Um, and those would be at the top of the list. So what's the next thing at the top of the list? If sustain or sustenance is one, uh, if rearming yourself is two, what's three? What does this guy need to keep going to save these people? Is it confidence? Is he looking for something more nebulous than just an item in the background? Like maybe if he comes across a picture of the family, if we're looking at it from a more modern context, or maybe there's if we had to look at it from within the time period of the game, maybe there's a girl's doll in the side of the room or something like that, and he sees that memento, and that's what gives him the moral or I should probably go with morale instead of going the other direction and just trying to make it work. Is that what gives him the morale to continue on more than bandages would? Uh, so maybe we need to think of this last one as an aspect of morale. So what are you grabbing from an environment that gives you morale? That's something much more abstract than what you're getting from interacting in a more concrete sense. And I think that's maybe what we'll go for. I think that morale could definitely be something that you scavenge from your environment, and it's maybe something that's connected to everything that you'd pick up in your environment in a survival horror game. It's the water or the air in our earlier comparison. Every single thing that you pick up in between, everything that isn't an enemy that's popping in and trying to ruin your day, is something that increases the player's morale and gets them to continue going forward. So,